Hey, greetings, everyone. Lieutenant Colonel Alan West here, the Executive Director of the American Constitutional Rights Union and the ACRU Action, as well as the Committee to Support and Defend. Please join us at theacru.org, theacru.org, and also supportanddefend.org, which is America's largest and growing constitutional conservative veterans organization. I'll be heading out to Mojave, I believe that's it, Arizona, on the 16th of this month. And I look forward to seeing all the veterans that are out there. We really got to get those men and women who have been willing to make that last full measure of devotion to continue to honor their oath to support and defend the Constitution. And speaking of the Constitution, there's a little kerfluffle going on right now. James Carville has even come out and said that the Supreme Court is not legitimate. And what that means is synonymous with the Supreme Court didn't do what we wanted them to do. Because if the Supreme Court is doing what the left wants, creating Roe v. Wade or, same-sex marriage and all these type of things that are based upon their ideological agenda, then the Supreme Court is great. But when the Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the land, the only court that the Constitution of the United States of America establishes, all of these other lower jurisdictions, as the Constitution said, they come from Congress. So if we have some of these judges like Judge Boasberg of the DC circuit up there, you can make him go away, but through the Congress, of course. But the thing that I want to kind of get started discussing with you all, because I think we have really need to get back to having an understanding of Civics 101 here in the United States of America, because we're suffering for a lack of knowledge thereof. We have three branches of government. And if you go back and you study Charles Montesquieu, the spirit of the laws, that's where they came from. The executive branch, the legislative branch, the judicial branch. And when you study the Constitution, our United States Constitution, as Madison and also Alexander Hamilton and John Jay did, by reading Montesquieu, you will see that the strongest branch within those three branches is the legislative branch. Now, when you read the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution really does list, it's about 18 enumerated duties, responsibilities, powers that go to the federal government, the legislative branch, like I said, the strongest branch. There are not many that are there for the executive branch, which is Article 2, and then even less for the judicial branch, Article 3. And so I think that once again, we need to get that right balance and understanding what separation of powers, checks and balances, and all of this mean. Because when you think about the progressive socialist left, the Marxists that are marching through the Democrat Party, like Sherman going through Georgia during the Civil War, they don't consider the three branches of government. They just consider the three branches of rule. And for them, the three branches of rule, because if they can't do it by legislative fiat, they just seek to do it by another means. But first and foremost, it's the media because they want to control the narrative. They want to be able to control how you think and what you hear. And that's why they're so upset that you have alternative news sources that are out there that, well, they're competing with the line that they want to have. And you can just go back to the Biden administration, see how they tried to censor your one of your very first amendment rights, the freedom of speech, because they did not want that, the freedom of expression, your free conscience. They want to be able to control these things, and which is another reason why they want to funnel kids into their type of schooling, because the second branch of rule for the left is academia. There's a reason why all of a sudden you see teachers taking kids to quote unquote anti-ICE rallies. Instead of, teaching kids reading, writing, arithmetic, as a matter of fact, you continue to see so many kids across the United States of America not doing math and reading at grade level. As a matter of fact, I think it's in Baltimore where there's a young lady that is suing the school system there because they graduated her and she's illiterate, can't read. And oh, by the way, I think it's great that Barack Obama's opened up his library, community center, whatever he wants to call it, in Chicago, a place where the teachers unions rule, and of course the reading and math comprehension levels are so low, most of the kids going to visit may not be able to read any of the things that are there, but that's what they want. So the media, academia, and the last one is the courts. And that's why the left is so upset that you have a Supreme Court that is a 6-3 conservative Supreme Court, which really and truthfully means that they're going to make their rulings based upon the rule of law, not the rule of, well, the rule, because that's what the left wants. See, when the rule of law is not in alignment with their ideological agenda, with their rule, then they will always default to their ideological agenda. And most recently, what you have seen happen, and what really has the left all up in angst, is because they lost the control of that Supreme Court. And oh, by the way, if you want to understand the importance of the filibuster, that 60 vote threshold, remember it was Harry Reid when he was Senate Majority Leader that made the decision during the Obama administration that they dropped that down to a simple majority to have judges pass through. And of course, when Donald Trump in his first term upset their apple cart and became the president, well, he was able to appoint not one, not two, but three Supreme Court justices, which of course the left will come back and say, well, he doesn't have the right to do that. I hate to tell you, that's in the Constitution. So, yes, the president does have a right to do that. And anybody that wants to be a Supreme Court justice has to go through confirmation by way of the Senate Judiciary Committee, because, again, that's part of the checks and balances, the co equal branches of government that we have. But now the left is upset because all of a sudden the Supreme Court decided 6-3 that this thing called the Voting Rights Act, Section 2, well, it's not really constitutional. You cannot go out and say that we're going to create districts, congressional representation districts, just based upon one thing, this skin pigmentation. What they have decided is that you must show that the standard is high. You must show some intentional racial bias, which will cause you to have to do this. Now, what I find really the hypocrisy is quite rich here. Because why do we have to have a Voting Rights Act in the first place? Because if you go back to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, those constitutional amendments that Democrats did not support, 13th Amendment was to free the slaves, end slavery, done. 13th Amendment. 14th Amendment was to give those recently freed slaves citizenship to include their children. That's why this whole thing about birthright citizenship is not in coordination with the 14th Amendment, even though they try to say so with the equal protection law and the jurisdiction thereof. It was applying to those who have been recently freed from the bondage of slavery. Again, an institution that the Democrat Party supported. But the 15th Amendment gave these recently freed slaves, just the men, of course, adult men, the right to vote. So why do we have to have a Voting Rights Act in 1965? We had to have a Voting Rights Act in 1965 because the Democrats, people tend to forget this little bit of history, but the Democrats were the ones who were disenfranchising black voters. They didn't want black voters to be able to vote. As a matter of fact, the Ku Klux Klan was established by the Democrat Party for the sole intention of intimidating blacks and keeping them from being able to go out and vote. This whole thing about Jim Crow, that was the Democrat Party. But when you talk about voting rights and you talk about the infringement thereof, when you talk about disenfranchising black voters, this is something, this is a tactic, this has been always the standard of the Democrat Party. Poll taxes, literacy tests, all of these things, it didn't come from Republicans, folks. It came from the Democrats. And so when you look and see what was going on, I mean, how the Democrats down south were drawing these districts to try to intentionally prevent blacks from being able to go out and have representation to vote, then that's why all of a sudden we came back and said, well, we want to have these majority minority districts to make sure that blacks are not disenfranchising from going out to vote, that they can, go out and participate in that which the 15th Amendment gave to them, the right to vote. But what the left realizes is that, hey, we could take this and we could turn it into our benefit. This can be a source of power and control. And also remember, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 did not pass because of Senate Democrats. It passed because of Senate Republicans led by Everett Dirksen. Before Spartacus, the senator from New Jersey, Cory Booker, came along, the longest Senate filibuster were Senate Democrats against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Again, we need to study our history. We need to understand civics. We need to understand that relationship. But getting back to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the whole purpose was because of what Democrats were doing down south. But then Democrats realized that we can take this and we can use this and we can make sure that these districts are always Democrat. And that's what you've seen happen when you look at the Congressional Black Caucus made up of members who are, well, for the most part, all Democrats. I was a member of the Congressional Black Caucus when I was there, and I will never forget how someone came up and asked me as I was, coming into Congress, "Are you really and truthfully going to join the Congressional Black Caucus? Why would you do that?" And I said, "Well, I think there's only two criteria. I have to be in Congress and I have to be black," because they had gotten so used to this being a monolithic, controlled Democrat caucus, which is just an extension of the Democrat Party. Now, the interesting thing is that when all of a sudden the case of Louisiana versus Callais came up to the Supreme Court, because once again it was challenged that the state of Louisiana went back, changed their maps, and redrew a district that was based solely upon race without any intentional racial bias being shown. But they just did it solely based on race. And everybody said, well, they're doing it in conjunction with the Voting Rights Act, Section 2. But this went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court looked at it and said, well, this violates the original intent coming out of the Constitution. And the original intent of the Voting Rights Act was really to make sure that intentional racial bias was not allowed to continue to prevail. You can't just say, we're going to make a black district, a black congressional district. And oh, by the way, I think if the left could have their way, they'd make a illegal immigrant congressional district, because there's a reason why they want all these illegal immigrants in the country. They don't want them. They want them to be counted in the census, which means it goes toward the apportionment of congressional districts. It should be about citizens. But getting back to this whole thing about the 15th Amendment and the Voting Rights Act, Section 2, what the Democrats are about to lose, and it had already has started, Florida, Tennessee, Alabama, not Georgia. Governor Kemp, what's going on with that? Why don't you want to do it? But anyhow, what is happening is that they're going back and saying, okay, well, we don't have to have these specific majority minority districts just because. We should have equal representation. We should have appropriate representation. And when you think about it, when you look at a lot of these majority minority districts, they're the ones that are lacking. They're the ones that are failing. I mean, you see the decimation of the traditional nuclear black family. Why? Because Lyndon Johnson was against that with his Great Society programs and handing out checks to women that had children out of wedlock. No matter how many children they had, they still get a check from the government, but they could not have a working man in the home. So you completely destroyed that traditional nuclear family. So today, 24% of young black children have mommy and daddy in the home. When I was born in a segregated hospital in 1961, that number was somewhere between 75 and 77%. You didn't see in my community growing up in the inner city of Atlanta, Georgia, the old Fourth Ward neighborhood, too many of us that didn't have mommies and daddies in the home. Complete difference. You look at education in these areas. Why don't we have more of these Black Democrat congressional representatives speaking out about parental educational freedom and choice? They don't, because they're owned by the teachers' unions. So, really, in essence, what the Democrats wanted was to have sole power control in these major urban population centers, even though when you look at these major urban population centers, which today have become 21st century economic plantations, because it's not about the physical change of enslavement, it's about the economic change of enslavement. They're happy with that because they continue to get wanton support without any challenge whatsoever. And now that's going to change. And the other thing that you seem to have happen is a lot of these, you know, black congressional representatives. I mean, how many of y'all remember Cold Cash Jefferson from Louisiana? That's where they found the cash that he had been pilfering in his freezer. Corrine Scott Brown out of Jacksonville, Jesse Jackson Jr. We just recently saw a black female member of Congress resign out of the Miami-Dade area because she was siphoning off COVID funds for her own private purposes. So maybe it is time. Maybe the Supreme Court was right to say these people in these communities, they should have the right type of representation, not just representation based upon the skin color, which to me, that's reverse discrimination. Now, some people are going to chime in and say what they're looking at in Tennessee, where you have this huge majority minority congressional district out around the Memphis area. Now it's going to be broken up into three different areas, and there's a chance that you won't have any Democrat representation in the state of Tennessee. Let's make sure people have good representation. And oh, by the way, I mean the irony and the hypocrisy from the left is quite interesting because there are states in New England that have had zero congressional Republican representation for quite some time. As a matter of fact, a lot of the leftists were cheering when they thought they could get away with it in Virginia and redistricting it from 6-5, which is a very good balance for what Virginia is, to 10-1 of congressional representation, of course, leaning toward the Democrats because they were going to take Northern Virginia and break it up into smaller congressional districts. So, really and truthfully, a lot of things are coming to light with this. And I think it's good for us to understand this civics. I think it's even better for us to get back to having representation that's not based upon the color of the skin, but the content of our character. There was a guy, I think his name was Martin Luther King Jr., who said something like that. The man from the old Fourth Ward neighborhood where I grew up. So let's start to understand that the left only wants a court that will implement their ideological agenda. And many of the leftists, James Carville once is one of them, have come out and said that, when we get back in power, you know how he talks, we get back in power, we need to stack the Supreme Court. We need to make DC and Puerto Rico states. Why? Because this is about power and control. This is not about good representation for the people in these districts. This is about them making sure they have a stronghold, they have a foothold. Even though when you look at these districts, represented by many of the members of the Congressional Black Caucus, is failing the ideological agenda of the left. And oh, by the way, you're looking at a guy who was elected to Congress to represent a district that was 92% white, that included the highest per capita income zip code in the country at the time, Palm Beach Island. And oh, by the way, there's a little house on Palm Beach Island that just happened to be in the district that I was honored to represent called Mar-a-Lago. Yeah, the home of the 45th and 47th president, who I had many of opportunity to meet with and sit down and talk with, and also had the same opportunity to sit down and talk and have dinner on several occasions with one of my very well-known constituents, a man by the name of Rush Limbaugh. So maybe this Supreme Court decision 6-3, which some people say have gutted Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, it's important because possibly we'll get back to having quality representation, not just representation based upon skin pigmentation, not just representation that serves the purposes of one political party to maintain dominance, power, and control, but representation that will honor the three branches of government, not the three branches of rule. Representation that will do what is right by the rule of law. Representation that will be, as our founding fathers intended, servant representation. People that don't want to stay in Washington, D.C. forever and ever and ever, but will do as I think it was George Mason who said 17 June 1788 at the Virginia ratifying convention for our Constitution. Nothing so greatly impels a man than to regard the interests of his constituents from whence he was taken, where he shall return and participate in their burdens. Founding fathers never meant for us to have a political elite class. They meant for us to have citizen legislators who went and did the business of governing, not ruling, governing based upon the consent of the governed. But the problem is that when we don't understand our fundamentals, when we don't understand civics, we, as the quote unquote governed, we don't understand that they truly do work for us. And we abdicate our consent to what will become a ruling political class. And just possibly, The Supreme Court decision in Louisiana versus Callais will be the first step in eliminating that political ruling class. Thanks so very much for joining us here on this episode of Live Free TV. Ask that you will continue to like and share Live Free TV with others. But most importantly, this is what I want you to do. Study our Declaration, study our Constitution, read the Federalist Papers, understand some of these decisions that are being handed down. Follow us at theacru.org because we try to take those things which may seem complex and make it real simple for you to understand. It's a republic if you can keep it. Till next time, steadfast and loyal.